Councilmember Jeanne Kohl-Welles, and I represent King County Council District 4, all in Seattle, west of I-5 from Madison Avenue to 145th at the border with Shoreline. Before we start, I'll take a moment to acknowledge that many of us right here now are on the ancestral land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, and past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I also now want to welcome you and thank you all very much for tuning in to our 5th annual Women's History Month panel discussion. As you can tell, this panel discussion is rather different than those in former years when we met in the historic courtroom on the 9th floor of the King County Courthouse. We had to cancel our program last year due to the pandemic, but I'm very pleased to be able to continue the tradition this year, even though meeting virtually. We have a fabulous program today titled Amplifying Women's Voices, Challenges, Inequities, and Moving Forward. Before we get to the panel, I'd like to thank the King County Women's Advisory Board, represented by co-chair Ziba Khalili, and the King County Equity and Social Justice Legislative Branch team, represented by Executive Director Saskia Crockwell, for co-sponsoring this event with me. And I'd also like to mention that Councilmember Kathy Lambert sends her regret she was unable to be here with us. Now, for some logistics, we are live streaming in 2 places, on Facebook, on my Councilmember Jeanne Kohl-Welles page, and via KCTV live stream. High quality live captions are available on the KCTV live stream, and a recording of this event will be available afterwards. We're also being shown live on KCTV channel 22. If you have any questions for our panelists throughout this event, there will be some time at the end for audience questions. We plan on keeping going until about 1:15 p.m. So you can also submit any questions at any time via the Facebook comment section on our Facebook live stream. And now I am pleased to introduce Ziba Khalili, one of this year's co-chairs of the King County Women's Advisory Board. Good morning, Ziba.
Good morning, thank you. On behalf of the King County Women's Advisory Board, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's Women's History Month program. Thank you to Councilmember Kohl-Welles for this invitation and to the King County Council for their continued advocacy on behalf of women. It is an honor to be in the company of such amazing panelists. For those who aren't familiar with the board, we work with the community to make recommendations to the King County Executive and County Council to support the well-being of women in our county. We're currently hearing from community leaders about gender-based violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence, issues which have seen an uptick during COVID-19. Our communities are at the intersection of 3 crises: a global pandemic, a deep economic recession, and a social uprising in response to police and state violence. We cannot improve the well-being of women without examining the systems that perpetuate the inequalities which community leaders continue to illuminate for us. And that examination must center race. Women of color have disproportionately shouldered the burdens of these crises, and our economy relies on women of color as workers, consumers, breadwinners, and caregivers, and yet our policies consistently fail to center their needs. We have an opportunity to do more and an obligation to do better. And I hope this Women's History Month serves as a reminder of the deep debt that we owe women of color, and that we ensure it is their experiences and voices that we center as we work to rebuild. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. A very apt summary of what we're doing and all we're working on. Thank you. And now for the Saskia Crockwell from Equity and Social Justice Legislative Branch.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Councilmember Kohl-Welles. My name is Saskia Crockwell, and I'm the Director of Equity and Social Justice for the King County Council. Welcome to this year's Women's History Month event. I want to begin by thanking Councilmember Kohl-Welles for inviting me to provide opening remarks. But I also want to stop for a moment and recognize that the reason we come together and celebrate Women's History Month is so that we do not become complacent, but to take time each year to celebrate the achievement that women have fought so hard to achieve, and to rededicate ourselves to tackling the challenges that remain. Councilmember Kohl-Welles is a leader in amplifying the voices of women and standing up to those challenges. I'm also excited today about this year's event, as I have several friends and colleagues on the panel, women who have been working to impact change in the lives of women, children, and families through advancing pro-equity policies, practices, and laws on a county and a statewide level, and by being intentional in addressing historical gender and racial inequities experienced by women and Black and Indigenous and people of color. And there's more work to be done. And what I know to be true is that change is possible, and these women are leading the way, which makes this year's theme even more relevant than ever: amplifying women's voices, challenges, inequities, and moving forward. So not to belabor my remarks, I will conclude with a quote from one of my superheroes, and she states, "Don't ever underestimate the importance you have, because history has shown us that courage can be contagious and hope can take on a life of its own." Michelle Obama. Again, thank you, and I look forward to the event.
Thank you very much, Saskia. And now to go on to our panel, and I will let you know ahead of time, we'll be a little rushed. I may change things a little bit depending on time, but I would appreciate everybody's answers to be very succinct to the questions that I ask. So when I think about today's themes, amplifying women's voices, challenges, inequities, and moving forward, I can't help but think about how over the past year more than ever, we've seen firsthand the resilience of our communities, but also the deeply entrenched inequities that continue to shape our society. We also know of the challenges of the past year that have been before us with coronavirus, and how the experiences of various individuals and groups have very much been inequitable. As we begin to see the hope of a new post-pandemic world, we know we will simply not be re-entering the pre-pandemic world that we left. Sometimes I still feel like I'm living in a science fiction novel or film. But I imagine that each of us in our own way has experienced loss, has struggled, and has learned something about ourselves. I hope today that we will have an opportunity to share space and deeply listen to the voices on our panel today. I'm really thrilled that each of our guests has taken the time to be with us, and I look forward to hearing their stories through each unique voice, which now brings me to our panelists. I'm going to introduce each one in alphabetical order, but I promise I'm going to change that order as we go along. First of all, my colleague, Council Chair Claudia Balducci, who represents District 6 on the Council, which includes much of the East Side. She's a mom, a transportation and affordable housing leader, and one who ambitiously tackles issues ranging from housing and homelessness to the environment. Not to mention, she's been doing a stellar job leading the King County Council through major challenges in the past year, and I'm very grateful that she was reelected for this year as chair and is with us today. Our next panelist, and how about if you all, when I introduce you, just raise your hand right at that time. Our next panelist is Roxana Pardo Garcia, founder of La Roxay Productions and the co-founder and project lead of Alimentando al Pueblo. I first heard about Roxana through her work with Alimentando al Pueblo, ensuring that the Latinx community has been able to access culturally appropriate foods in response to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm so appreciative of her on-the-ground work, and I'm very pleased that she has joined us today. With us today is another member of the King County Council team, Christina Logsdon, who serves as Chief of Staff for Councilmember Rod Dembowski. She's also the president of the board of the Win-Win Network and co-chair of the Asian Pacific Islander Americans for Civic Empowerment PAC. I can personally attest to the dedication and compassion Kristina exhibits daily in serving the individuals of District 1 and all the council, and I feel very fortunate to work with her. Our next panelist is Sharon Navas, co-founder and executive director of the Equity in Education Coalition. Sharon's work revolves around the complexity of being multilingual and multicultural in America, as she herself has lived experience being the firstborn American child to immigrant parents from Guatemala and El Salvador. We are honored to have Sharon with us to provide important insight on the challenges faced by educational systems, as well as caregivers and students throughout this pandemic. We also have with us ChrisTiana ObeySumner, a community organizer and activist and the CEO of Epiphanies of Equity, LLC, a social equity consulting firm that specializes in social change, intersectionality, anti-racism, and disability justice. Recently, you may have seen ChrisTiana as a panelist on a lecture series, Understanding Ableism, convened by the King County Disability Consortium. I've been very appreciative of ChrisTiana's insights on that panel, and I'm excited that they could join us today. And we have Washington State Supreme Court Justice G. Helen Whitener, highly impressive to say the least, with her appointment to the state Supreme Court in April last year and subsequent election last November. Congratulations. And is the first Black woman to serve on the Washington State Supreme Court, the fourth immigrant-born justice, and the first Black LGBT judge in the state of Washington. We're honored that she is with us today. So to open up now for our panel discussion, I'm going to ask an opening question for each of you to take a minute or two to respond to this question. And ring a bell, or there'll be some sound that Clara will provide to us, or Lorena, when the 1 minute is up, but you can take up to 2, but just to give you a little warning. Each of you has approached your work for women through a different lens. For example, a racial equity, an intersectional lens, a grassroots lens, and another one could be an inclusivity lens. So the question is, how do such lenses strengthen your work, and what are you most proud of about the work you've done during this pandemic? We'll go right down the row in alphabetical order, starting with Claudia.
Thank you, Councilmember Kohl-Welles, and I just want to thank you for pulling this together every year. It's always such a great event. I love this question because it causes me to think about my own biases, if you will, sort of like what lenses do you look through at the world at? And so I was raised by a mom. I was the only daughter in my family, and she gave me an equality lens. And I carry that through life, regardless of how far I go. And the equality lens is anything a man can do, you can do, my dear. And that is what she taught me. And it has got some great pros to it. It teaches you self-efficacy. It gives you, like I was the kid at summer camp who, when they said there's a boys softball team, but there was no girls softball team, I just marched down there and tried out and dared them to tell me that I couldn't play. But it masks, that kind of equality lens masks systems, and it masks privilege. It makes you think that everything you do is your own effort, and that somehow you can break through things just by effort of will. And I think we've learned, and COVID has been a great teacher in this regard, that is just simply not true for many, many women, that we need to develop lenses that are more inclusive, more intersectional, that racism comes to bear, ableism comes to bear, systems interlink together to hold women down, frankly. And so I think that my lens of equality is something that I grew up with, but one that I work to evolve in order to do a better job of legislating and policy making so that we can lift up all women.
Thank you, Claudia. And next, Roxana.
Hey everyone, buenas tardes. I'm Roxana. Appreciate being on the panel with such amazing, amazing people. To answer your question, I think, I bring multiple lenses, but, I was born and raised here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm very fortunate to live and to serve the community that I grew up in. I'm a Iberian resident. I went to school in the Highline Public School System, and I am, again, very blessed to be able to be of service to the communities that raised me, that saw me grow up. And I think that all of the experiences as a brown woman, as a woman who grew up in a bicultural, bilingual, multicultural, multilingual community and household is what informs the work that I do. I think in large part, I always say that there's something about theory, but there's also something about action. And I think the pandemic has really shifted and prompted and moved me to be about action, to be about doing. And when we started Alimentando al Pueblo, this food bank, I was like, why don't we have food banks that give people the food that they eat? Like, that just seems like a very, just surface level trivial, like, why not? And we just did it. There was no permission that needed to be asked. It was literally about doing. And our food bank was founded by the very people that it serves. And it was the co-founders of this food distribution site and this model are women. They're all mujeres. They're working class women. They're women who are immigrants. There are women who are mothers who are, contributing to the raising of children in our community. And I think that that's probably something that has just been really validated and affirmed by this pandemic, is that the communities that are who are at this nexus of like struggle, intersection, are the ones who have the solutions. And it has been brought to my attention, and again solidified, that we have the creativity, we have the will, we have the courage, we have the bravery, everything to be able to create and manifest the world and the society and the communities that we are so deserving of, right? And it's so incredibly important that we do it in a joyful way. I think that, the work of social justice and equity and liberation is hard. It hurts us sometimes, but I also believe that on our journey to those places, we can find joy. And that is what's going to keep us moving forward. And so
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roxana. Next, Kristina.
Well, I also just want to thank you. And I am just really honored to be on this panel with such amazing women. And I am really excited to hear from each and every one of you. I wish we had more opportunities like this to get to know each other. And so thank you so much, Councilmember Kohl-Welles, for giving me this opportunity. And in response to your question, I was thinking about it and I was like, I think I reject the notion of a lens, because a lens implies it's something you can pick up and you put on and then you take it off. And all of these things that, that you had mentioned, like a racial equity lens, an intersectional lens, a grassroots lens, an inclusivity lens, they are just part and parcel and central to who I am as a person. And I don't decide, I don't decide when I use a racial equity lens versus a grassroots lens. I can't remove and replace my lens. They just are just so much a part of who I am, and they strengthen my work because they're ingrained within me. I don't consciously need to choose which lens I see through, or I just don't consciously need think about it. Though it wasn't always that way. I am originally from West Virginia. I am, I can trace my father's family back to the 1700s, but my mom is an immigrant from Japan. And growing up in West Virginia, I was one of very few people of color in my high school, in my school. I mean, I graduated from a class of like 140 people, 100 to 140 people. I mean, we were really small town. And so you can imagine I was very aware of being a person of color in that environment. And it has, I've struggled. It's many people probably can share, like the internal struggle that you have accepting that you are different and growing to be proud of that. It took time. And so I was, at a young age, aware that I was a person of color. And although some of these lenses were ingrained in me at that time, it took a while for me to be proud and to acknowledge that, yeah, I am different. And I am also share all these things that are similar to everyone. But
Kristina, I'm sorry, we're going to have to go on.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was going that long.
No, it's so fascinating. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I can't hear the little bell that's going off. So
I can't either. I'm really sorry.
No, fascinating reply. I'd like to hear more, but we do have a very tight time frame. How about this? If we're getting to the point where I think we need to wrap up your answer, I'll just kind of go like this or something. Great. Thank you, Kristina, so much. Now, ChrisTiana.
Well, I think going off of what Kristina was saying is very to what I would say. And to preface again, thank you for having me. This is phenomenal. It is really like a prism, and depending on how you hold that prism up to the light, you may see different spectrums of that light, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those spectrums are extricable, it can be separated from the full prism or what the prism means. Similarly, I think for the work that I do, it is important to hold intersectionality, and that includes especially what it means to live to both identify and have the expression of the gender construct and how that impacts us. When I was navigating my gender identity and expression, I did so with a stage mom who put me in pageants as young as 6 months old. And as I started to navigate in what my previous career before a consultant was, which was going into psychology, specifically social psychology and social work, it was really interesting to sort of see those ways in which how the world sort of perceives me, that looking glass self, and how I move through the world can really impact the ways that I can move through the world, whether I'm walking, say, on cement versus in sludge. I think it's important for us to think about those impacts, especially the historical and systemic impacts of these things. It's sort of like having a well on your property and you realize your well is toxic. But you do need to go upstream and see where that toxicity is flowing into things. And so holding disability justice, and the first of those 10 principles being intersectionality, it's inextricably intertwined, as well as identifying, as a womanist, but as a non-binary person. And what does that look like, especially in my intersections in these times? So I think that, to what has been said, you can't really take it away or sort of parcel it. It's not a pie chart. However, I do think that there's a lot of us who need more than the crust of a pie. We are always sort of fighting for having a fair slice, but we've really only been getting some crumbs of the crust. And there's some of us who actually just want the whole pie. So some of this work has been in the pandemic, looking at what does it look like to start to, making sure that we all can eat.
Okay. Thank you, Christiana. I just love hearing all of these. Really good. I wish we had more time. Okay, and next we have Sharonne.
I'm going to make mine really short. I don't think I can say anything much better than the folks that have done it already for me. I don't, like Kristina, I don't see this as lenses. These are just lessons and lived experiences that I've had to internalize, recognize, understand, and do better about. I had the privilege of growing up in a very, very diverse area. So being Latina was not necessarily my center from the very beginning until I moved to Washington State, at which point there were times where I was the only Latina in the room. Sometimes I was the only female presenting person in the room. So I had to relearn culture, relearn that understanding. I do not have a disability in my worldview, so I am often aware of my mistakes and try to learn from them. But I also, I have the privilege of being in conversation with several of the women and people on this panel. So they've all educated me on how to be better in terms of my intersectionality. I think I'm going to leave it there.
Well, you can bring somewhere out on another question. Thank you, Sharon. And Helen. Justice Whitener.
Helen is fine. We can use first names. Thanks for having me, council member. And it's really an honor to be here with all these powerful and inspiring women. For me, it's not so much my lens, but it's the lens that society has viewed me through. And they have placed labels on me, but all of the labels they have placed on me come from a place of disenfranchisement. My race, my gender, my sexual orientation, my ability or lack thereof, that's their lens. I always saw myself as humane. I see the humanity in everyone. I'm so intersectional, and I have so many different labels and parts to me that I think with the pandemic, I finally think that people see things my way more so than they did before. They're seeing the benefit of seeing how we work together rather than how we have been working in our separate silos. They see sympathy as not being the way to go about things. They see it more as empathy, which has always been my lens, so to speak. So I think if I have to give a label to me, it's always been a humanity lens. And the pandemic, I think, has shown others empathy, because there by the grace of God go I. So people are now being able to see themselves in situations they otherwise would not have seen themselves in. So I think they're more open now to the discussion, which we're going to, of course, have a little bit more of today.
Thank you very much. That was a great opening on all of your parts. And I'm going to go on now to ask some individual questions. So not the same question for all of you. And I'm going to try to mix the approach and the format up a little bit as we go along. So Helen, I'm going to start with you on this round. You are known as a staunch supporter of equity and justice. This year, in a year of record demonstrations, but also a lot of controversy about the judicial system as a whole, what are your thoughts on the future of the criminal legal system post-pandemic? It's rather a broad question.
It is.
But I want to before you start, you'll have 2 minutes for each response. I was going to do it at 3 minutes, but I want to get more questions in. And for audience members, you can submit any questions for the panelists by going to my Facebook page and put those in the comments. So Helen, please go right ahead.
I hope I remember the whole question after that.
Well, about the judicial system, what do you see is going to happen?
Yeah. And you started by describing me as being for equality and people seeing me for that. And I think that's erroneous. Because for me, it's not about equality. I don't want to be equal because I'll never be equal. I'm starting from a less than place. Equity is about fairness and neutrality, and there we have some issues as well. For me, it's about eliminating barriers so that everyone can participate at their own place. Having said that, I think the pandemic has shown us that there are some inequities in our system that needs to be addressed. And hopefully we coming together can do so. But I think in you chatting, I think I forgot the focus of your question. So if you can repeat it, I would appreciate that.
I said, okay, you're known as a staunch supporter of equity and justice. This year, in a year of record demonstrations, but also a lot of controversy about the judicial system as a whole, what are your thoughts on the future of the criminal legal system post-pandemic?
And that's a great question, because post-pandemic, I think we're learning about some of the inequities in our system. We have a shortage of funding in our courts, and we're realizing how that impacts different parts of the justice system. For example, technology is wonderful. We can get individuals to participate more if they have the use of technology. Video conferencing platforms, for example, would eliminate people having to come into the court for rudimentary matters. The problem is we're also realizing that those individuals that we're thinking of to utilize this platform in that way don't have the economics to do so effectively or efficiently. So there are loopholes that we're going to have to work on, but funding and civil legal aid funding, which I believe we have received some of that now coming through, and we will be able to assist individuals in our community with that. That's really important because most people that come before the court are coming before the court on civil matters. And we're going to have the landlord-tenant issues. We're going to have a number of issues, divorce issues, just many civil matters. Now, in regards to the criminal justice system, what we're seeing is we need to have some systemic and structural changes in the way we were doing things and in the way we were accepting things. And that goes not just to the running of the court, but our interaction with law enforcement, the way different communities are treated by the court, bail system still needs to be addressed, economics in regards to the collateral impact of being sentenced or the label, felony label. So these are some of the things the pandemic has raised up. We knew it was there, it's just raised it up to the forefront. And we have a lot of stakeholders that are at the table right now addressing not just the race issue and the disproportionate impact the criminal justice system has on people of color, but also as a whole, how we can better these systems so that we can move forward treating individuals more humanely. So we come back to humanity and seeing people through empathetic eyes.
Thank you very much. Claudia, you've been leading an agency, namely the County Council, through a tumultuous time. What principles and values have guided your leadership at this time?
What's interesting is that when I think about this question, I think about sort of what we do and how we do it, and just starting with the how, just adapting to not being able to work in the council chambers was a really big deal. This is a body that does its work by holding public meetings, and we could no longer hold public meetings. So what does that mean? How do you legislate? How do you represent the community? And jokingly, the two things that I have said over and over again to remind myself of how we're going to get through this, I talk about radical transparency and, you know, what feels, this phrase I say to myself all the time, it feels like over communicating, but it's just communicating. Like we have to talk all the time and be sending out messages all the time and continually working with each other. Because look, I've got this going on, right? This is a lunch happening behind me here, it happens every day. But then there's sort of the what we do. So just working from home and being an organization that didn't even allow remote testimony or remote video, that was one thing. And that was a big piece of work. But suddenly we were faced with this tremendous immediate need in the community. People who needed to know how they were going to get food. How are they going to go to work? How are they going to stay safe? We provide public health, you know, in this, how are we going to keep people healthy? How are we going to get testing done? What are we going to do about people living on the streets? Who are going to be at much higher risk of infection, et cetera, right? So I was really proud of the fact that we were able to move quickly. And I know this comes up later, but we moved pretty quickly for government. We stood up locations for people to be where they could be safe. We stood up testing sites, vaccination sites. We learned very quickly, as I said earlier, COVID is an incredible teacher in many ways, and it teaches us about the inequities in our society. The disease spread showed up in the Latinx community way higher and way faster than in other parts of our county. The South End, geographically, can have a lot more essential workers, a lot more people having to travel, a lot more concerns about childcare. And so things that we talk about as being, philosophically how we should do our work and be equitable became really real. like the needs for our services showed up in places very, very impactfully, very quickly. And I was glad that we rose to it. I was impressed with how we rose to it, but also with this mindset of you have to always be willing to grow and learn and change and adapt, because we sure heard back from people, yeah, you think you did a good job, but you didn't really get into the communities where we needed you the most, or you didn't really deal with the issues that we were trying to tell you about. And so now we grow in our work and try to do things better each time we take it up. And that'll come up later, I suppose. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your very outstanding leadership on all of this. Sharonne, the pandemic has not only impacted students, but also families, as you all know. What new roles have moms and caregivers had to take on during the time of the pandemic? And what do you think government can do better to work with community-based organizations to support these families, particularly BIPOC families and communities?
Thank you for the question. To be honest with you, I don't think there's new roles that moms and families have had to take on. Moms and women and female presenting people have always had to take on doing it all for everyone without any pay, without any support. We've always had a narrative around women, moms, aunties, female presenting people, that they can do it all, should do it all, and they need to be very, very good, if not excellent, at it all. And the pandemic has shown us that we might talk about wanting to be a community village that raises the families, and we all are intersectional, but the reality is that we left our women behind very, very early on. They were the ones that had to transition to work from home or leave their jobs to stay at home, to be caretakers, to be the new educators, to be like Roxana, who created this whole entire organization to feed our people. The pressure of being a woman and a female presenting person during COVID was tremendous, and it is still tremendous. And we don't talk about the mental health and the trauma and the impact of being a woman or a female presenting person during a pandemic. I'm sure most of you know that small restaurants and retail stores small businesses are started by women. They're owned by women. Minority women are some of the biggest economic producers in our state and in our country. And we absolutely didn't support them at all during this whole thing. I'm sorry that I'm coming in like, full guns blazing, but that's a horrible term, by the way. But I think, I think we put even more pressure on our women and our female presenting people to be better, do more, without at all thinking that, we were already extended to 110% before the pandemic. And then we had to figure out, how are we going to get our moms, dads, aunties, uncles, and nephews and siblings vaccinated? How are we going to get them tested? How are we going to get them educated? How are we going to make sure that we can do work from home, work gig platform jobs like DoorDash and Instacart and still be safe and not worry about having to bring the pandemic home? A lot of our female folks are nurses, they're healthcare workers, they're teachers, they're educators, they're frontline folks, they're janitors, they're home health aides. And there was an assumption that they were going to do it all and be amazing at it. And the reality is that our shoulders are just not that wide. We have needed to do more for our female presenting and women folk. Childcare was, I hear so many people talking about the educational system as a secondary childcare, where women just want to send their kids to school so that they can go back to work. The reality is that our families have to go back to work. There is no way that our families, especially our BIPOC families, are going to survive the 2008 recession and the 2020 recession all on top of each other. The federal program came out with the PPP loan, the payroll protection program, and it was horrifying to get support. I run a small community-based organization, and I cried with my banker on the phone when I finally was able to put all the paperwork together. And I can't imagine being a small business owner who doesn't speak English as a dominant language trying to navigate that system. So I think we saw two things during the pandemic. We saw the absolute worst of our people with the hate crimes, the assumptions, the bias. And also we saw the absolute best of our people. We saw people like Roxana come in and just be like, to hell with it. We're not asking permission. We're going to ask, if we have to ask for forgiveness later, that's what we're going to have to ask for. But, they did it. And just like every other female and woman presenting person that I know, we took the bull by the horns and made the best of it.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I can't help but think of what it was like years ago when Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, wrote the book, The Second Shift. She should probably update it, referring to it as the third shift or the fourth shift that women experience. And I, as a mother of 5 children and as a single parent years ago, I can really relate to what you're saying. And that was without a pandemic going on. Okay, Roxana.
I'm ready.
And by the way, Roxana, we will, Clara, what did we decide to do since the timer isn't able to be heard?
I'll send direct messages in the chat.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, go right ahead, please.
All right. And same question as Sharon?
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to get to that. A lot of your work this year, as you've already mentioned, has centered around starting Alimentado El Pueblo, a culturally specific food bank. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what inspired you to start this initiative and what the impact has been so far on your work?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer all those in the time allotted.
Just a little bit.
The inspiration came from a conversation I overheard between my aunt and my mom. And my aunt was talking about how she didn't want to go to the food banks because she, one, didn't use what they gave her, that she would just kind of leave, but that she really needed to access. She's like, I actually would prefer to leave the food there for people who need it versus taking it and having to find out what to do with it later. So it's like the self-sacrificing situation, and where she's like, I need food, but I don't want to take what I don't know how to cook. And it just kind of triggered my own memories of growing up in poverty and accessing food banks and how I felt going through food bank lines and having to say no to like everything that was presented to me, because I was like, I don't know if my mom knows how to cook with this. Because I'm Mexicana. We grew up eating Mexican food. That's all really we eat. And so I called up all of my homegirls who happen to be executive directors of nonprofits or pastors and of Colectiva Legal del Pueblo, Southwest Youth and Family Services, Lake Berrien Presbyterian. Sharonne jumped in as well with Equity Education Coalition, Para los Niños. And I said, hey, what do y'all think about a food bank that gives people the food they eat? And of course they were like, yes. And we're like, all right. And we just kind of made it happen. It was a very organic process. And at the core of, I think, as Sharon mentioned, like when the pandemic hit, and as someone who understands like racism and colonization and white supremacy, when the pandemic hit, I had this like feeling of doom and overwhelm of like, oh my gosh, this is going to be really bad. This is going to be really bad. And also understanding genetic memory and epigenetics, this concept that we pass on memories through our genes and through our DNA. I was thinking about the 7 generations ahead and all of the babies and all of the families that were going to be created and we're going to inherit the memories of this pandemic, the grief, the loss, the instability, the pain. And I was like, what do we do? Like, this is way, bigger than what it is. And so it's really about at the core of this food bank, it's about helping write in joy and abundance to the genetic codes of our community, because they deserve to have that moving forward.
Well, thank you very much for your endeavor on this. And I am really pleased that the county council did allocate funding for food sustainability and culturally appropriate food. And there is funding in the new the 7th COVID budget that the executive transmitted to us last Wednesday. Very important. Okay, ChrisTiana. Ready? The pandemic has hit the disability community especially hard. from accessing vaccines to getting the health care and support needed. What do you see as some of the major barriers that you've seen the community face? And if time, what can able-bodied folks do better post-pandemic? That's probably a lot in 2 minutes, but.
Yeah, well, if I had to boil it down to anything, I would say ableism is the biggest barrier to disabled folks right now. And especially given the pandemic, there has been a lot of disregard for disabled voices in the pandemic. At the foundation of disability justice, it is to not only have intersectionality, but also leadership of those most impacted. That's the second of the 10 principles. It's rare to see openly disabled folks, especially those with invisible and disabilities, chronic illnesses, and intellectual and developmental disabilities, be in positions of leadership and resource holding power. Especially as we have went into a virtual workspace. The virtual workspace is something that disabled folks have been advocating for decades. And now that we are in it, non-disabled folks are starting to say that they are tired of it. And that's scary because while there are some disabled folks that this has been really difficult and they would, otherwise thrive in being in in-person environments, there are a great many of us where the virtual space has allowed for more integration into community than we ever had before. And that says something. As people are talking about being fatigued and pandemic tired, that they also have to realize that they may be talking about sort of moving away from the space that has been leading to more disability justice. And in addition to that, there has been a bit of virtual colonizing of the virtual workspace as these things such as Zoom and other sort of spaces that have came into popularity so that non-disabled people could work have not been incorporating the calls to action of disabled communities that has been happening for decades as well. And this is just talking about disabled folks who are working. This is not, in 2 minutes, we can't talk about the extent to which there are non-disabled people who are talking about how 12, 14, 16, $2,000 once a month is enough. And yet we are asking folks, especially on SSI as opposed to SSDI, to live off of something like $715 a month. We have income, we have the limits on how much you can have we have limits on how much you can have in sort of resource holding for is at a cap of $2,000, and move-in fees, if you had to save up for, it's going to be way more than that. This is not even talking about environmental racism, racialized ableism, policing, housing, the extent to which we're ensuring that our housing is ADA accessible, and whether or not we're actually considering not only intersections of disability, but also invisible disabilities, chronic illnesses, and intellectual and developmental disabilities when we're talking about disability, as well as thinking about disability justice as beyond accommodations and beyond the ADA, because as we know, rights-based frameworks do not get to the heart of these issues. It's really hard to explain all of the different sort of barriers that disabled folks are facing in COVID-19, but if I had to boil it down to a 2-minute answer, it's ableism.
Thank you. Very poignant. Kristina, the pandemic has been hard on all communities, we know that, but has especially hit recently very glaringly. The AAPI community's hate crimes have increased significantly during the pandemic, although they've always been there. How does your role in the council tie into more local efforts for equity and social justice? How do you think government can show up more for the AAPI community further than making statements?
Well, first of all, hate crimes against the AAPI community are not new. How many of you have heard of Vincent Chen? Vincent Chen was murdered in Highland Park, Michigan back in 1982, which is actually not that long ago, by two men who blamed Japan for the loss of jobs in the US auto industry. And never mind that Vincent was American and of Chinese descent. And you think of 9/11 and how South Asians and Muslims were treated. Growing up, I was constantly called chink and Jap. And although I lived in West Virginia, where there's little diversity, I would bet that all Asian Pacific Islander Americans, no matter where they live in the US, can point to a time or can point to being called names at some point in their lives. It's no matter how many centuries back we can trace our families in the US, we are seen as the perpetual foreigner. And this othering isn't confined to the AAPI community. We need to take a hard look at ourselves, at our country. Yes, things are really bad right now. It hasn't helped that our former leader of our country perpetuated hate and actively called for violence against people. But this hate isn't new. And really, until we as a country own our atrocities, it's going to be difficult to move on from them. As a kid, I didn't learn about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. I didn't learn about it until I moved to Seattle at the age of 26. And there are still people today who refuse to believe that slavery was bad. So, elected officials can show up more for AAPI communities and for BIPOC families by understanding your own power and privilege, how you can create an environment where people feel safe to speak up, where they feel less listened, where they feel heard. You can show commitment by including us in the beginning stages of problem solving instead of making decisions for us. Government can fund organizations that are led by us and hire us into leadership positions. And don't look at us as AAPIs or even BIPOCs as a monolith. We have an incredible diversity of beliefs, languages, and a huge class divide within us. And don't expect that one of us can speak for all of us. But really, it's a cultural problem, and we're going to need a cultural solution. There's no one easy, quick answer here, and the answer can't be given by one person or even in one listening session.
Thank you, Kristina. Okay, I'm going to start another round, and I can see our time is getting scarce, so I'm going to probably have to adjust a little bit. I was going to have 2 more rounds plus a little kind of lightning rod, but Roxana, what are some unique barriers that you have seen women in the Latinx community face during the pandemic? 2 minutes.
All right, 2 minutes. I would definitely everything Sharonne said applies in terms of women not being validated or affirmed or credited. I would tell you that it is the women in my community who have hustled to get their families resources. Every time we have done our food distribution site, it has been women, mujeres, who are in those cars picking up food. It has been women who are reaching out to ask about rental assistance and about utility support. Like, if it was not for the women in our community, they are the ones who are the access points. And they do not get the credit that they deserve. Again, this pandemic has not shown us anything new. It has only amplified what has existed. And I think that I just really want to give all the credit to the women that I interact with every day in and day out in our food distribution site. Again, our site is operated 99% by mujeres, by women in the community. And I think it's just it's not anything new. It's just that I think we need to give them the credit. They deserve the credit. They deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve to be cared for. They deserve rest. And we're hoping that through our project, we are able to just to recognize them and give credit where credit is due.
Thank you, Roxana. Kristina, again, one of your self-proclaimed passions is systems change work. And this year especially, we've heard a lot of calls from for our existing systems to be changed and reevaluated. What do you see as your role in advancing this work? And can systems be reformed from within? And if so, what do you think is the primary role of activists and advocates from outside the system? That's a lot in 2 minutes. Take your choice, what you want to answer.
Okay, I'll try to be fast. Well, I absolutely believe that systems can be reformed from within, but it can't happen in a vacuum. And I really wouldn't be in government or have taken this job if I didn't believe that could happen. A huge systems change that I'm seeing and that I'm so excited about is around the criminal legal system. I saw firsthand how one's experience in school can beat you down, affect your self-esteem, make you feel like you don't have anything to contribute and that you're worthless. My brother, God rest his soul, responded to bullying by fighting back. And many times while he was suspended, the bullies weren't. And over time, he became seen as a troublemaker. And it didn't matter if he started the fight or not, the teachers would never believe him. The thing is, my brother was whip smart. He skipped kindergarten. He was incredibly loving, but he hardened as an adult. And he made bad decisions, got in trouble with the law many times. He's been gone from my life for over 20 years, but my heart still aches at how things could have been treated, had it could turned out differently. So I ask, what if we didn't take a punitive approach to things? What if we believed in our youth and our young adults and the ability to be rehabilitated? What if we looked at our lives holistically and the trauma that we have suffered and worked actively to not re-traumatize people? So you asked my role in advancing this work. Well, some of you might know that 10 years ago, when there was talk about the Children and Family Justice Center, that my boss, Rod, supported unifying the family courts and worked to pass the bond to fund the Children and Family Justice Center. So, knowing this history, I was really nervous about approaching him about posing the youth jail, but he became an advocate and he calling for the country to pause and reconsider building that jail. So, of course, I can't take the credit. No new youth jail advocates were incredible. They were amazing. They got our attention, and academia and researchers have proven that alternatives to incarceration have better outcomes. Systems change often takes this outside force to push us out of the status quo and to see things in a different light, and we need it all. We need outside and inside. Oh, you're on mute.
Accidentally. ChrisTiana, again, a lot of your work focuses on intersectionality. For someone who may not know so much about that, how would you describe it and where do you see it show up in your work?
Yeah, so I think what's most important really quick is to explain what intersectionality's original intention is and what it has sort of shifted to be today. Intersectionality's original intention was to specifically look at the compounding impacts of anti-Blackness and misogyny. It was a concept that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s when seeing that Black women were systematically kept out of getting work at automobile manufacturing company, who said, well, they hire Black folks and women, so they don't know why Black women weren't getting the job. It must have been their fault. And they were hiring Black folks and women, primarily Black cis men for back of house sort of assembly line work, and primarily white cis women for front of house community facing work. So in this, there was this compounding impact of misogynoir, or misogyny specifically experienced by Black women. Today, it has sort of shifted to like two or more lived identities, whether or not they are systemically or historically oppressed, exploited, or marginalized. And I think that we need to get a lot closer back to Kimberly Crenshaw's original intention of this, even if that means two or more lived experiences of systemically or historically impacted identities. Most importantly with intersectionality is that it is, again, not a pie, it is a prism, meaning that it is inextricably intertwined. So say in my experience as a Black disabled person who is a non-binary person, I have an experience of racism or anti-Blackness and Black liberation, which I share with other Black folks and other Black, brown, Indigenous folks. I have an experience of marginalization based on my gender expression and identity, which I shared with folks of all marginalized genders. And I have experience of ableism, especially racialized ableism, and I share that with other disabled folks, especially Black, brown, Indigenous folks. There is a specific quaternary experience here that is inextricable at my intersection of my race, my disability, and my gender. And that's not even bringing in size, of which I was a person of large size for most of my life until I got sick about 6 years ago. And that impacted my ability to get healthcare at 400 plus pounds. That's including my class, including being on Medicare now and what it means when I show up with a Medicare card to my doctor's appointment, and everything in between. And those are things that we cannot parcel out, as Audre Lorde says, we're not single issue beings. We don't live single issue lives. We have to hold the full constellation of folks, as well as the full constellation of what it means to be in society, which all the way back to the old Greek guys, right, who said the society is an intentional sort of practice and action with each other. So we're going to hold that. We have to really think about why humans human, and when humans are humaning with other humans, certain human things happen. And being able to do that, especially if we want to bring parity to areas of disparity, which I think is the bottom line for all equity work, we have to really look at the full constellation of folks, or we will never truly have the full nuanced understanding of how to move that work forward. And the best way you can do that is to slow down to the slowest person and let them lead, as I heard from a colleague of mine comment. And to really truly have the leadership of those most impacted. We can always gain knowledge. As you can see, I like to gain a lot of knowledge, but we will never have the wisdom unless we have that embodied lived experience. So if you see that there's someone without that embodied lived experience in your decision-making circles, then it would be important to make sure that those people are at the decision-making table and that they are able to also give the feedback to determine whether a table is the best place for organizing.
Thank you very much, ChrisTiana. Helen, you embodied a lot of first for the Washington State Supreme Court, and I'm wondering how that influences the work that you do, and how can your influence and your position help other women follow in your footsteps?
Well, what I love is having that answer be asked right after ChrisTiana. Yes, I'm Washington State's first Black female Supreme Court Justice. I am the first Black LGBT Supreme Court Justice in the United States of America. I was the first in Washington State, and found out recently I'm the first in the country. I identify as someone with a disability. I have a back condition that will get worse over the years. I am the fourth immigrant born and raised on the island of Trinidad and Tobago. And as you can tell, I have a lot of intersectionality going on. So ChrisTiana's response was right on. Being a first, I think it's important, especially if you're an elected first, is that you took on a responsibility to be a voice, to be a presence in whatever position that is. For me, I have to uphold the Constitution as it's written. However, what's beautiful is bringing my lived experiences and my lens to bear on the interpretation of that law, makes space for all of the different facets of who I am. So I think it is truly important that not only that I show up, but that I speak up. And in my position, I write up as well. I also think it's important to give back. And by that, I mean mentor and support others so that they themselves can get to wherever they want to go. It doesn't have to be where I am at, wherever they want to go. That's why when you ask, I'm not for necessarily equality, that's wonderful, but I think it's limiting, and here's why. We're starting from behind. If you're in a disenfranchised group, you're starting from behind. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm already ahead. So giving me equality is putting me back. What I want is something more in line with equity. And what I'd love to see is something more in line with remove the barriers and let everyone perform at their best. And that pretty much might put me ahead in some respect, but it might put me behind in some respect. As women, we are starting from behind. And I think removing those barriers help us move forward wherever we're at a lot faster. So for me, it's a responsibility of being accountable, of being transparent, of giving back, creating support mechanisms where there aren't any, to make sure that I'm not the only one, that there are other firsts. There are going to be quite a few because, we still haven't overcome yet. But I want to make sure that I do well enough that those with power realize they're not losing anything by having us join them. We're just enhancing the conversation. We're making it a little deeper. We're enriching the environment as opposed to taking away from, which is how they tend to view change and inclusivity. So that's how I see myself influencing others. getting here the way I did and recognizing and being authentic about who I am and exercising my voice, my authentic voice in the conversation. You're on mute.
Thank you very much. I found your comment very poignant about how there are those who do not think they are giving up power if any other group is able to advance. And I think that is so true, more than ever. Okay, Sharonne, what are your thoughts about intersectionality in terms of how you work with a community-based organization and trying to effect social change?
My organization is a education policy organization, has been since its very beginning. It wasn't until really COVID showed up. We dabbled a little bit on intersectionality, but our hope was that if we did the right thing for the kids most affected by the opportunity gap, we were doing the right thing for most kids, right? The targeted universalism ideology. But I think like the rest of the state, I had the privilege of having some blinders on before the pandemic. I don't know that I really gave much thought to the internet and digital equity when it came to families that aren't privileged like mine, that have internet at home, that can get a laptop very quickly if should something break down. I think a lot of us thought that although we all hate the idea of spending 58 to 60 weeks at home by ourselves without any friends, I think we all assumed that most of us would transition well. And I think it wasn't until we started realizing that it wasn't just about handing out laptops. It was about 18,500 families in King County alone not having access to the internet. It was about 285,000 students in Washington State not having access to the internet that we realized we were talking about almost 300,000 kids out of 1.1 million kids. We're talking about a third of our children. And that doesn't include the 600,000 seniors and elders in our state who are afraid of technology, who don't know how to use technology, don't know how to use a smartphone. And the best example of intersectionality that I have is teaching my mom to get on FaceTime with me was a trial and tribulation for me. And I love her very, very much, but there was a lot. And I think, women like Roxana and people like ChrisTiana help us and aid us and make us better, because they unfortunately are often talking about intersections that aren't necessarily in the forefront of others. And I thank them for ensuring that we're all always thinking about migrant workers, undocumented workers, folks that are dealing with physical, showable and non-showable disabilities. And I think we have to do better.
Thank you, Sharon. And as I think you know, the Council placed a high priority on digital access for all the groups that you've mentioned. And a large part of that was because of your happiness and other community-based organizations. So thank you on that.
Thank you.
Hey, Claudia, as an elected official, how have you included women in working on legislation and your everyday work through use of an intersectional lens, especially pertaining to racial, socioeconomic, and gender equities?
So I'm going to take that question slightly sideways, because there was a second part to it as I read it, and I'm going to just say this. One of the key things that this entire discussion always brings up for me every time I listen to people like are on this call is that it really matters that we have broader representation at leadership roles, in representative roles, in government, in the private sector, everywhere. And I think one of the things that intersectionality means to me is that you're never going to have perfect representation because people are just too individual and they have too many individual circumstances. I love what ChrisTiana said before about not being pie charts that you can take a wedge out of. Like, we are all the totality of who we are and all of our experiences. The more experiences that we bring into our institutions, the better we're going to do at representing the people that we represent, hearing from them, knowing where to go to hear from people so that we're not just listening to the same folks over and over again and institutionalized interests. The better we're going to get at identifying problems, solutions to the problems. Things, I have to say, I've been at King County now in one role or another for over 20 years. And I've seen a lot of change. The way we do public engagement has changed tremendously since I first started this work, where we would basically think of something we wanted to do, come up with a proposal, and then maybe if we remember to, go out and have a public meeting and ask, hey, what do you think? And interpret basically whatever we heard back as, hey, we're okay with it, let's go on, right? Sort of like the ultimate box checking kind of exercises. And we've evolved through a number of different ways of getting better interaction with the public to a place where we now have some new models that we've adapted, equity cabinets, et cetera, where we bring together people who bring their lived experience. We pay them some money for it, by the way, because it's labor that we're asking for from people. And then we say, you help us define what is needed in the community. You help us define how we provide services to the community. And then they expect us to do what they say. It's not just like, give us some ideas and we're going to go off and do whatever we want. And I see this sort of turn that government is taking, and that works much better the broader representation is. And so I always ask women, and I hope women are listening today, think about running for office, please. Think about whether this is the thing that you can do, and don't assume that, oh, I couldn't possibly, because you could. Many people could do this for part of their career. It doesn't have to be a calling for your whole life. You could step into a role like this. You now know people. Here we are on your screen. You can probably find us if you want to. You certainly can find me and Councilmember Kohl-Welles. If you're interested in learning how to run for office and bring your experience, right, not to the table, to the dais, where you get to help make the vote and make the decisions, we want to encourage you to do that, and we want to help you to do it. If you have any questions, please reach out. I know I've gone over. Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Jeanne.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to now provide the opportunity for panelists to ask a question of another panelist, but it has to be really short, and the panelist who's being asked the question would have to answer within 1 minute maximum. So do I have any takers? Any question you would like to ask someone else on the panel?
I have a question.
Claudia.
I have a question for Roxana. I was very taken by what you said. Why don't we feed people the food they eat? And I thought, so now that you've been doing that for a while, can you just say, are your moms, your mujeres taking the food home and eating it? I mean, how has the reaction been to that approach, which seems very basic?
Yeah, like I said, thank you for the question. I can tell you that we had one distribution on last Monday, and we start at 12:30, like that's our standard time. And we had a line starting at 10 a.m. So people line up 2 to 3 hours before we even start distribution because they enjoy what they see in the boxes. I talk about my aunt, the one who inspired, who kind of was like the one who like made me remember all the things. And I give her food boxes because, again, credit is given where it is due. And I remember when I gave her the first box, I actually had never seen anybody open the box. And I saw her face and she was like, I can't even explain to you. And when we first started doing the distribution, we would ask people, because we had different boxes. We have a Mexican box and a Central American Caribbean box. And we would ask people what box did they want, and they just would look at us all weird. They just, you know, they didn't understand. And it was because it had never been done before. But I will say that people love the boxes we give, and unfortunately, like, there's more need than we are able to support, but hopefully with more funds, we can make it happen.
Well, that's what we're going to try to do. And our next COVID budget will be taken up on April 20th in our budget committee. And I'll follow up quickly, Roxana. I could see that this would be really important to provide these boxes at senior centers all over the county who do give out lunches and sometimes breakfasts and dinners. And has there been an effort to do that?
We actually got, because a lot of people were hitting us up for, like, how do we do this in our neighborhoods? And I'm very much like, the people who live in that neighborhood should be the people serving. And so we are creating a training program to train other community-based organizations or pre-existing food banks to better serve more diverse populations. So those trainings will actually be unfolding in the next couple of months.
Thank you so much. Is there another question somebody would like to ask of a different panelist? I can think of a lot, but I don't want to dominate here.
ChrisTiana raised her hand.
Who did?
ChrisTiana raised her hand.
Oh, ChrisTiana. I'm sorry, I didn't see. Go right ahead.
This is technically could be a question for all the people, but I am interested in, this question is for Justice Whitener. You're sharing about how you're the first to do these things. And the first question that came up in my head is sort of, as you are sort of cutting through the thicket of being the first, how do you care for the wounds from the thorns? Or another way of saying this is, as you're blazing these trails and being the first to move through these spaces, how do you keep this sort of sustainable for you? And ensure that your soul is protected in those in that work.
Thank you so much for asking that question, ChrisTiana, because there's an assumption because you succeed that somehow you're strong and you're strong all the time, and you're not. You know, there are a lot of thorns, especially when you're marginalized as much as I am, and as you indicated in your case as well. But I rely on my wife. You know, I tend to go to her, and I get a lot of support there. I grew up with the thinking that you never let them see you sweat. So I don't show externally, publicly, some of the pain. But there's been a lot of pain in charting this course. And there's a lot of pain that comes with standing and getting others to acknowledge your presence and everything else. And just last week, I was on a panel, and I thought, a question that was asked of me was very profound, because the assumption was, after discussing my marginalizations and everything else, the individual said, but how can you be when you're so accomplished? And I had to laugh, and I responded, I am accomplished in your eyes, not because of these marginalizations, but in spite of. And with that came a lot of hurdles to overcome. But at the end of the day, I realized somebody's got to do it, because I'm the first in certain arenas, but I'm standing on the shoulders of many women and of many people, you know. So I'm kind of torn with this first thing. I just think I'm the first to be recognized, but I'm not the first that was capable of being the first, if you understand what I'm saying. So for me, I look inward, and I share a lot of my pain with my wife. But thanks for acknowledging that it is painful, because I also point out, if I can, Jeanne, that my privilege that people see with this position, it comes with the title. The minute I step out of this room that I'm in right now, all they see is a Black woman. The minute I can't get out of my car and I got to use my cane, they're like, but she was fine 10 minutes ago. What's up with the cane thing? You know, the minute they see me with my wife, it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, the minute I speak and I'm a little in pain or hyper, my accent comes out. It's like, whoa, where is she from? So everything about me speaks to exclusion, and I have to work really hard to get folks comfortable with being inclusive, and then understanding I need to perform well, otherwise I shut the door for so many others that are worthy, so it's hard. Thanks for acknowledging that. I do appreciate that question.
Thank you, both of you. And that your statement is very appreciated with the heartfelt emotion, feelings, thoughts, really powerful. Thank you, Helen. Are there any other questions? We can take one more. Nope. Okay. Well, I have one last question, and it's not quite a lightning round, but very short, like 20-second answers, maybe 30 seconds at the most. But I'd like you each to just say one thing that you've learned during the pandemic that you hope others will take with them in moving forward. And please be sure, if you want, to answer this question within the context of our discussions today. So we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. Helen.
Very simply, we are one. Today was me, tomorrow it's you. If you don't acknowledge our unity and our connectedness, tomorrow it'll be you. So we are one, and we should move forward united.
Great, thank you. ChrisTiana.
I would say the one thing that I learned in the pandemic is when we talk about dismantling structures, we have to go beyond dismantling structures. We have to go beyond fortifying foundations. We have to do a full environmental review. We have to see the extent to which there is toxicity in our air, soil, water. As we already know statistically, that is the number one determinant. Race is the number one determinant of whether you're going to live next to that. We have to see the extent to which our water table, or mycelium down to the bedrock, is toxic, and we need to make sure that we are going upstream to see where those toxins are coming in, because if we don't, we will be doing this forever. While it may seem like it's not going to give you the results that you want in the timeline that you want, I think that it's more important that we do transformative radical change, and we go as deep as we possibly can and take those seventh generation mindsets than to go a mile wide and an inch deep.
Right. Powerful message. Thank you, ChrisTiana. Sharonne.
For me, my lesson was that we are all in this together, that systemic racism, institutional hurdles, all the isms, they're all created by people not on this panel. And while we need to push them to dismantle it, it is our opportunity. I consider this our FDR moment. All the people on this panel can come together, and I strongly believe we can revolutionize not only the systems that we all work in, but our society as a whole. I think we can, for the seventh generations down, create a system that values us, not just for the work that we put in, that makes it easier for white CIS men to be mediocre and still become president, but for the amazingness that we all are. I think we don't value ourselves enough, and I think we need to start there.
Thank you very much. And Kristina.
We had I think it was produced by our Office of Equity and Social Justice, and we had a speaker, Ben Danielson. And one of the things that he said that's really stuck with me is, how do we use the dark skies to see the stars better? And I think like this is the time, right? This is, how do we see the light in the darkness? How do we use this opportunity? Because without, and one of the things that I go back to is this quote by Frederick Douglass is that, without struggle, there is no progress. There's way more to the quote, but I'm just using part of it. And that even though we're going through some hard times, it's giving us an opportunity to really take a deep look And, you know, Judge Whitener, what you had shared about how much is on your shoulders, I want to encourage those who are in positions of power to share how difficult, what is on your shoulders and how difficult it is. Because if we don't accept that and point that there is some difficulty and there is some unpleasantness and there is trauma and hardship, then if we don't expose those things, how do we move on from it? How do we really share deeply our feelings with other people and create empathy and help others to see empathy and feel empathy? Because really, I think that's what we're really missing in this, especially in this country right now. So anything we can do to create that kind of environment right now, please do it. That will help us in the seventh generations that move on from us.
Thank you, Kristina. Roxana.
Something that I hope that people take from this pandemic is, one, we're tired of struggling. I'm trying to move from like struggling to living to thriving, and we're still keeping we're in this struggle mode. And I think that what this pandemic has shown us is that we have everything that we could absolutely need within ourselves, within the collective, to again create the worlds that we deserve and that we desire and that we dream of. And I hope that we all rest. I think that this pandemic has forced me to really slow down and to rest and to cultivate a dream space, because our liberation is intimately tied to what we can dream and what we can imagine. And so I hope that people imagine with an incredible amount of creativity, because I think that the world that we are all so yearning for is really, really close. And again, we know what doesn't work. We know absolutely what does not work. And so there is no use in replicating or recycling or repeating. But I hope that we are all courageous to risk what we don't know, but what we know, what we can feel.
Great. Thank you, Roxana. And Claudia, to wrap this round up.
Yeah, I learned a lot of things in COVID times so far. But I would say the one thing I hope we take with us, when you've worked inside an institution for a long time, it can start to seem like change is inevitably slow and painstaking, that it can't happen quickly and it can't happen, you can't have big change, right? You got to incremental all the time. But we learned in COVID that doesn't have to be the case, even in the most hidebound institutions. So, at the beginning of January last year, I asked, in 2020, before we went home, I asked everybody, hey, think maybe you could join me in an experiment where we won't print out all these papers all the time for our meetings? And one person raised their hand. I'm going to call him out for my Zahalai. He was the guy, he was going without paper. And then suddenly we all went without paper forever and we're never going back. Like, it wasn't something we could do. Homelessness, we struggle terribly to house people in this region. And I've been fighting to build a homeless shelter on the east side for over 10 years with a whole group of people. Suddenly we opened a bunch of homeless shelters, a whole bunch of them all at once. And we did it differently. We did it so that people were treated respectfully with a room and a door and privacy and a bed, not a mat on the floor. And surprise, they did much better. People did much better. Their challenges were lessened. Their suffering and burdens were lessened, and they did better. And we can change how we do things. We can do big things. We can do them fast. I just hope we take with us out of COVID the belief that we can, because it was the belief that was keeping us from doing it. Just in our own heads, it's not possible, but it turns out a lot more is possible than we give ourselves credit for.
Thank you, Claudia. And I'd like to mention one other item before we conclude. Sarah Reineveld, who's a former chair of the Women's Advisory Board, I believe still is a member of it, attended a conference at the Attorney General's office on Friday, at which Justice Whitener spoke. And she said what really were words that were provided that Sarah wants to live by. Helen said, kill them with excellence. I'm not sure the context of that, but I love it. I wanted to bring that out. So we are unfortunately at the end of our program, and I really give a heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their time and their thoughts and their words and their passions with us. I wish we had more time. There was one question that had come in, but the person is on the council staff, and we'll get back to her on that. But I'd also like to thank KCTV for broadcasting our event, and to Andrew Jayasundara on our council staff for designing the poster. And we'd be glad to get one of those to you all on the panel eventually. And my staff, who were phenomenal in helping me put this together: Lorena Gutierrez Perez, Clara Manahan, John Fowler, and Adam Cooper. And this year, more than ever, I think I'm struck by the real honesty and the resiliency and the courage of these individuals here on our panel. And there's, as we've talked about, there's still so much work to do, and we've got such a long way to go. But I think this is a reformational time in our society, and that will exist for a long time. We are making transformations through a huge amount of struggles, as we know. But look at these leaders on the panel who are stepping up and bringing about the reforms that have been needed to be made for decades, for centuries. And we're going to make a real difference here. I thank our panelists so much for what they are doing, as well as for being on this panel with us. And I also thank our viewers for tuning in, and I hope that you have found this program as beneficial as I did. If you have any more thoughts, contact me and any of the panelists who are on Facebook, and follow up with us. And I look forward to our next Women's History Month panel next year. Thank you all.